Allen Allensworth was one of the most noted black individuals of his era. Give you some background information. A number of years ago, the Monrovia Historical Society used to enter exhibits in the historical section at the Los Angeles County Fair. In fact, we won some prize money. One year we did a Route 66 exhibit. The backdrop was a simulated map painted on a panel of Route 66 all the way to Los Angeles. And we borrowed a Model T Roadster and placed sand to approximate a desert locale. Anyway, while that was under construction, I thought, well, let me see what else is going on. So I wandered around to look at some of the others, and among them was an exhibit about Allensworth State Park, which I thought was interesting. So I started to read it, and it mentioned that Allen Allensworth, the namesake of the town of Allensworth, had died in Monrovia in 1914. And I thought, geez, I don't know anything about this. So I decided to do a little research. And I had the date, I mentioned the date, so I checked the local newspapers, and yes, indeed, Colonel Allensworth was visiting Monrovia in 1914. He was coming to preach on a Sunday. He was walking up South Myrtle Avenue. By south, I mean the section south of Huntington Drive. And he was struck by a northbound motorcycle carrying two riders, taken to the Monrovia, well, it was the Haven Hospital then, later known as the Monrovia Community Hospital. It still exists, although it's no longer a general hospital, where he died of his injuries sometime later. I filled in the blanks and did a little initial research and then stopped. Fast forward to 2002, Second Baptist Church, which was formally organized by Colonel Allensworth, was about to celebrate its centennial.
This is in Monrovia, the
Monrovia.
church in Monrovia.
So I picked up the research thread once again, but previous to that, I had stopped by Monrovia City Hall and talked to an employee there who said she had visited Allensworth and that the docent had said directly that there was some suspicion surrounding the circumstances of Colonel Allensworth's death, or outright stated that they believed, they being the personnel there, believed that he had been killed in Monrovia, which was kind of disturbing to think that something like that would have happened in Monrovia. Not impossible, but disturbing. So I did a little more research, and I called the local Santa Anita Municipal Court, which at that time was a functioning municipal court. It's now a training facility. I asked them, because I'd learned, I think from my earlier research, that there was a coroner's inquest held concerning the colonel's death. And I thought there might be court records somewhere about that coroner's inquest. So I called Santa Anita, and they said, well, no, we don't have any records like that. But there is an archivist in the court system in Los Angeles, and perhaps she would have some information. So I took the phone number and the name, and I called, and I explained who I was, and that I was researching the death of Colonel Allensworth, hoping that there might be some court records that I could look at to gather further information. I wish I could tell you her name. I have it written down somewhere. But her response was, I'm familiar with the case. And I said, you are? And she said, yes, I know the colonel's granddaughter. Pause for chills. Okay. So I don't think I contacted her directly, but I think she was able to put me in touch with Josephine Blodgett Smith, who was named for her grandmother, Josephine Allensworth, who had grown up in Los Angeles and was at that time 86 or 87 years of age, but still very, very lucid. And we talked, and then someone from Second Baptist and I went to visit her in person. Second Baptist invited her to come and speak at their centennial celebration, which she did quite eloquently about her grandfather. A remarkable woman. She actually lived in a Paul Williams designed house in Los Angeles. She knew Paul Williams personally, the noted black architect. So when it came time to design a home, she'd ask Paul Williams if he wouldn't design it for her, and he did. Quite an interesting structure. So I was able to tell her what I could about Colonel Allensworth that I'd learned from initial research, and she filled in with some family anecdotal material that she'd heard growing up. I don't think that she necessarily thought her grandfather had been murdered, but she thought there was more to the circumstances than had ever been made clear. So let's stop for right there and talk about Colonel Allensworth himself. I've set the scene in terms of his initial contact with Monrovia and his death here. But he was born into slavery April 7th, 1842 at Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky also having an association with Monrovia in the person of Aunt Kate Wright, who lived there for a number of years before she ultimately came to Monrovia. He was the son of Phyllis and Levi Allensworth. His mother named him for Bishop Allen, an eloquent preacher of the AME's church, in other words, African Methodist Episcopal Church, whom she hoped he would emulate. Phyllis Allensworth encouraged her son to become educated and suggested that he learn to read and write, even though this was illegal for a slave, by playing school, quote unquote, with the son of his mother's owner, who was receiving regular instruction himself. In this manner, he learned all that the son was learning in school, even though he couldn't let on that he was learning. These efforts to become literate, however, alarmed his owners so much that in the spring of 1854, they intervened by sending him to a rural plantation in Henderson County, Kentucky, as a punishment for attempting to learn to read and write. He became a member of the Pat Smith household. His thirst for knowledge continued, however, in spite of all the obstacles placed in his way by the Smiths. He and an orphaned white boy, Eddie, who was also a member of the household, studied secretly whenever it was possible and reinforced each other's learning. To condense, he continued wanting to learn. It continued to get him in trouble. He finally ended up being sold in New Orleans. Blacks used to say down the river, because down the river meant you were being sold further south into conditions that were much less hospitable than where you'd been. Are you familiar with the expression down the river? Sold
Sure,
down the river?
Sure.
Yeah, that's what it meant. It was a punishment. It meant you were going to be probably mistreated and probably used excessively. He worked for, Fred Scruggs trained him as a jockey. He was with Scruggs at the outbreak of the Civil War, returned with him to Louisville, and after that, at the outbreak of the Civil War, he'd made 2 unsuccessful attempts to escape earlier. The outbreak of the Civil War and the close proximity of Union troops, he was able to make his escape into the Union camp, and assured that if he went further north, he could be assured of being free. He joined the Navy. He served for several years in the Navy. Beginning in 1863, discharged honorably in 1865. He worked in Mound City, Illinois, joined his brother in St. Louis, where they had 2 successful restaurants. They sold those at a nice profit. Allensworth went back to Louisville. The major turning point in his life, he had a religious conversion and ultimately decided what he wanted to do was to be a minister. He worked as a janitor at the American Missionary Society of New York. They'd opened a training school for former slaves in Louisville. He supported himself by working as a school janitor, but also took courses during the day for formal instruction. 1875, he became a teacher, even though he had not yet given up, or had not given up the idea of becoming a minister. He worked for the State University of Kentucky, and then he had pastorates. He went back to school to reinforce his academic training to be a minister. Went to the State Street Baptist Church in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and married his wife, Josephine, the former Josephine Lavelle, in 1877. They were married in Trenton, September 20th, 1877. She was a trained musician who assisted him in his ministry. Josephine Blodgett Smith described her grandmother. She said she looked almost like a white woman. She said she had blue eyes and light skin. So, as frequently happened in the South, between the fog and the grog, there was some racial intermingling, and Mrs. Allensworth reflected that heritage. Allensworth became a respected speaker and sought-after speaker. He went on the lecture tour with the Williams Lecture Bureau of New England, became interested in politics, served as a delegate to the Republican National Convention at Chicago in 1880. I dare say he may have been the only delegate of color to a Republican convention in 1880. Also a delegate to the same convention in Chicago in 1884. About 1882, some black soldiers were in the Black Regiment of the United States Army, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, asked if he wouldn't consider becoming a black chaplain. Allensworth had accumulated a fair amount of influence because of his speaking tour, his presence at the Republican National Convention, and his other connections. So he applied to become a chaplain in the United States Army. 1886, President Chester Alan Arthur was appointed Allensworth chaplain of the 24th Infantry Regiment with the rank of captain. They left their final pastorate in April of 1886, going to Fort Supply in Indian Territory. So what's Indian Territory now? Oklahoma. They had 2 daughters, Nella and my grandmother used to say, give me a minute. Anyway, 2 daughters who joined them at the Army post. After 20 years being stationed in the Philippines, several stateside assignments, he applied for retirement. One interesting sidelight I have here, he participated in the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1892, which gave him the opportunity to meet and talk with Frederick Douglass, so they were acquainted. He was mustered out with the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1906. He was the highest ranking black officer at his time, the highest ranking chaplain, and the highest ranking black officer at his time. He and his family relocated to Los Angeles probably in 1906. I found an article about a GAR convention in Los Angeles in 1905 where he was a featured speaker, but he was referenced as living at that time in Salt Lake City. So sometime in 1906, he and his family relocated to Los Angeles.
And then do you know at what point he had the concept of creating Allensworth, and what was the idea behind that?
Okay. He joined, I don't know when the idea began, but in 1908, he joined with two other men, one an educator, and they founded Allensworth. Well, they founded a colony. I don't know that they first called it Allensworth, but they were able to buy land in Kern County. And they wanted to establish an all-black community, which was self-governing. The point was to demonstrate to those who thought that blacks were incapable of properly governing themselves, that they were quite capable, thank you, and very good. They could establish a community with structure, schools, churches, and govern themselves and do it quite well, quite capably. So that was the goal of establishing it. Kern County, because the land was affordable property, there was water, it was close to a railroad line. So they started it in 1908. A major setback was the death of Colonel Allensworth. That's referenced in several histories of Allensworth itself. Another setback, the railroad changed the destination or the railroad station from Allensworth to another location. That deprived them of the railroad traffic. The company that sold them the land was not completely honest about the water supply. The water supply began to fail, so the community gradually declined in population and vitality and became almost a ghost town. There were a few families who stayed, but by and large, most people relocated. It was ultimately restored and is now a state park. Colonel Allensworth State Park. Probably a half dozen, or maybe 10 of the original structures survived. The Allensworth House survived, the churches, the school, the library. Some of those more substantial buildings survived. They've been restored, and they're the focal point of the park. A couple years ago, Larry Spicer visited with his family, took lots of pictures, which he sent back to me, so you get wonderful interior shots of these buildings. Colonel Allensworth was buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles with full military honors. I've gone there and visited his grave. In terms of the circumstances surrounding Colonel Allensworth's death, one theory was it was a Ku Klux Klan hit. And I thought, well, I don't know. I'm not aware that the Ku Klux Klan was active in Monrovia. At least, there's no indication that there was a branch. Then I thought about the two men who were riding the motorcycle, and I tried to find out more information about them and didn't get very far. Then a couple years ago, I went to the bank, Citizens Business Bank here in Monrovia, and was waiting to talk to the new accounts clerk, but was sitting next to two people who were there. The father, their father had recently passed away, and they needed to notify or check in with the bank regarding what process was necessary to get the accounts changed over properly. It turned out that they were the daughters of Ernie Ray, a longtime Monrovian, whose grandfather, Frank Fleming, lived in a little house on South Jasmine Avenue in Monrovia. The Rays came from Oklahoma. I think there were something like 6 daughters and a son. And Frank Fleming, his wife, I believe, died quite young. Frank, I believe, spent the rest of his life on South Jasmine. Anyway, Frank's daughter, Lou, I think she might have been either Lulu or Louisa, married a Ray, D.L. Ray, I think. And they were in Oklahoma in 1914, immediately prior to Colonel Allensworth's death in Monrovia. The story I got from the daughter was that they wanted Ernie to be born in Monrovia. So they left, I don't know where in Oklahoma, but the husband, Lou's husband, was driving a motorcycle and Lou was riding in a sidecar. And given the state of roads in 1914, I'm surprised that Ernie was not born en route, jarred loose as it were. But Ernie was born in Monrovia July 4th of 1914. So I thought about that, and I was able to say, or to verify to my own satisfaction, that Ernie's father was the same man who was riding, one of the two men riding on the motorcycle. So I thought, I don't think that Ernie's father would have been in Monrovia long enough, like 7 days, to have been drawn into a plot to kill Colonel Allensworth. The testimony that the two men gave in the coroner's inquest was that they tried to avoid, they were driving north, they were trying to avoid hitting Colonel Allensworth, who became frightened when he saw them approaching. He jumped one way, they tried to dodge another, and they hit him. I can't say with certainty that it was an accident, but to me it has all the indications of an accident. And that's what I've told, that's what I've indicated to people who've questioned the circumstances. I think they were young, they were irresponsible. I think they thought, we're gonna buzz somebody, give them a scare, and it backfired, and they hit him instead. I don't think there was any way, since he was northbound as was they, and he undoubtedly had a hat on, I don't think they could tell from the rear that he was black or not. So I don't think it was based on race. I think it was just an unfortunate accident by two irresponsible young men who shouldn't have tried something like that and did. So, as I say, buried with military honors and now honored with a neighborhood treasure, very close to Second Baptist Church on South Shamrock in Monrovia, the third location for that particular church, and placed there because of his association with its formal organization and its first pastor.